Welcome Philosophy 1150 students to the third video lecture in the summer 2020 semester. You'll undoubtedly notice that I've neatened myself up a little bit. I've given myself what I like to call a COVID-19 cut, where you just take a basic set of barber trimmers. You can get these at London Drugs for 20 bucks. Put a 1-inch guard on them, or shorter if you care to. And as long as that guard doesn't fall off, it's pretty hard to screw things up. And even if my new haircut doesn't look as perfect as it possibly could, it'll grow back anyway. So, if you have page 2 of the notes and exercise questions, we're going to move on to the third of our binary connectives. Referring back to the nifty chart on the bottom of the page, the connective symbol itself is a sideways U, or if you notice the name of it, the horseshoe, or an equivalent symbol which is more pictorially illuminating. You can just have an arrow pointing to the right. So the basic English equivalent for this logical connective is if-then, or if you wanted a single word, implies or entails perhaps. The compound sentence that's formed when you paste two smaller sentences together with the horseshoe is the conditional. Notice that unlike the conjunction and the disjunction, the conditional has separate names for each of the two parts. The part that occurs before or to the left of the horseshoe is called the antecedent. The part that occurs after or to the right of the horseshoe is called the consequent. Here's why. Let's consider two simple sentences. Capital S is going to stand for you are in Surrey. Capital B is going to stand for you're in British Columbia. At this point, normally people might ask the following question, well, what if you are in Surrey means you are in Surrey, England? The answer to that is that if capital S were intended to stand for the simple sentence, you are in Surrey, England, it would be indicating a different proposition or commitment about the world than the one I'm intending it for. So I'm intending this capital S to stand for you are in the Surrey where Kwantlen is. You are in the Surrey in the lower mainland, one of the outer municipalities of the greater Vancouver region. That's Surrey. So if capital S is used to indicate you are in that Surrey, and we wanted to indicate you are in Surrey, England, that would be a different proposition, and so it would require a different letter. So we have you are in Surrey, you are in British Columbia. Here's a simple conjunction, a simple disjunction, and a simple conditional. You're in Surrey and you're in British Columbia. Notice if we just switch things around, so we've got a mirror image conjunction, you're in Surrey and you're in British Columbia, you're in British Columbia and you're in Surrey. Switching the order of the two conjuncts doesn't change the nature of the compound commitment made by that conjunction. Same thing with the disjunction. You're in Surrey or you're in British Columbia, or both possibly. You're in British Columbia or you're in Surrey, or both possibly. So with these two, it doesn't matter which order the two parts come in. That doesn't affect the nature of the commitment about how the world is that you're making by asserting one of these symbolic claims. Now let's consider the conditional though. The way we would read this is, if you are in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia. That's true as a matter of geographical fact, but notice what happens if we switch the order in the conditional. If you're in British Columbia, then you're in Surrey. This sentence is false, whereas this one is true. So you're very definitely changing the nature of the commitment you are making when you switch the order of a conditional from S horseshoe B to B horseshoe S. The order matters with the conditional. Doesn't matter with the conjunction or the disjunction. That's why we've got two separate names for each of the two parts. The if clause, if you like, the part that occurs before the horseshoe, that's the antecedent. The then clause, or the sentence that occurs after the horseshoe, is called the consequent. The whole thing is called the conditional, and this symbol is called the horseshoe. We can now consider how to make symbolic sentences containing the horseshoe, that is to say, conditionals or if-then sentences. Recall that as far as the English sentences go, there's three potential different kinds of things we can find there. Simple proposition indicators, logical relation indicators, and finally, logically irrelevant stuff that we can just edit out or ignore. So if we have capital S stand for you're in Surrey, capital B, you're in British Columbia, we could have the following 5 sentences. You're in British Columbia if you're in Surrey. You're in Surrey only if you're in British Columbia. If you're in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia. Only if you're in British Columbia are you in Surrey. If you're in Surrey, you're in British Columbia. How do we symbolize these sentences? It turns out that there's just a couple of straightforward principles we need to be aware of in order to correctly symbolize sentences like these. One thing, just divide these two, that's crucially important when we're considering conditionals are the logical relation indicators. There's a big difference between an if that occurs in an English sentence and the two-word phrase only if, from a logical point of view. The principle for sentences containing the word if is as follows. Make the sentence immediately after an if the antecedent or the part that comes before the conditional. Make the sentence immediately after an only if, not the antecedent, but the consequent or the part that comes after the horseshoe. It doesn't matter what order various things occur in. The only thing that matters from a logical standpoint is, does the sentence contain an if or does it contain an only if? In a language like English, there are subtle differences in meaning between these sentences because whatever clauses are put at the beginning of a sentence are emphasized more than the ones that occur later. So with this first one, you're in BC if you're in Surrey. This sentence is indicating a certain logical relation that holds between being in BC and being in Surrey, but it's also emphasizing the implications of being in BC. This second one, you're in Surrey only if you're in British Columbia, is also specifying a logical relation that holds between being in Surrey and being in British Columbia, but it's emphasizing being in Surrey, and so on. All right, so what do our principles tell us? In the first sentence here, we've got an if. So what does the principle tell us? Make the sentence immediately after the if the antecedent of a conditional, the part that goes before the horseshoe, and the other part, the be, becomes the consequent. The second sentence, do we have an if or an only if? We have an only if. So here we use the second principle. Might be helpful to number these. This is principle 1. This is principle 2. The second principle says, make the sentence immediately after an only if, not the antecedent, but the consequent of a conditional. So what comes immediately after the only if? You're in British Columbia. The other part, you're in Surrey, goes there. The third sentence, if you're in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia. So the question to ask ourselves, do we have an if or do we have an only if? We've got an if. What occurs immediately after the if? The sentence, you're in Surrey, so that goes before the conditional symbol, namely the horseshoe. The other part comes after. The fourth sentence, only if you're in British Columbia are you in Surrey. This time we've got an only if, so it's the second principle that applies. And since it's an only if, the sentence that comes immediately after the only if is the consequent of a conditional. The other part becomes the antecedent. Finally, if you're in Surrey, you're in British Columbia. Again, we've got an if, so what comes immediately after the if is the antecedent. The other part is the consequent. All 5 of these sentences then are making one and the same commitment about how the world is, which is, as a matter of geographical fact, true. If you're in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia. Look at the difference between 3 and 5. If you're in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia. If you're in Surrey, you're in British Columbia. So number 5 doesn't have a then. That makes no difference logically. The then is just a stylistic device. Doesn't change anything, it just smooths out the sentence. 2 and 4, we've switched the order of the clauses. That's an emphasis thing, not logically relevant. We just edit it out. So we focus in then on whether or not the sentence contains an if or an only if. If the sentence contains an if, what comes immediately after it is the antecedent of a conditional. If it contains an only if, what comes immediately after it is the consequent of the conditional. That's all you really need to keep in mind in order to symbolize English sentences that contain either the word if or the 2-word phrase only if. Now we can consider a number of exercise questions. Look at page 6 of the Some Notes and Exercise Questions file. It says Philosophy 1150 Translation Practice Questions at the top. So it's got 2 different exercises. They do things a little different in this particular book. They give you the letters for all of the simple sentences at the top all at once, and then you apply them to the various sentences below. They also use letters instead of numbers. Let's start with A. John will make supper only if Mary is working late. First question, do we have an if or do we have an only if? We've got an only if. So what does that mean? Whatever occurs immediately after the only if is not the antecedent, but the consequent of a conditional. What occurs after the only if, logical indicator phrase, is Mary is working late. So that's W. In the other part, John will make supper, is J. The second question, Mary will make supper if John is working late. Once again, the first thing you ask yourself, is it an if or an only if? It's an if. What occurs immediately after the if? John is working late, so that's L. It becomes the antecedent of a conditional. The other part, Mary will make supper, which is M, becomes the consequent. So you don't have to worry about which clause comes first. You don't have to worry about where the if or the only if occurs in the sentence. You just have to specify, is it an if? Then what comes after it is the antecedent. If it's an only if, what comes after it is the consequent. We move on to question 3. John will not make supper unless he is very hungry. So, John will make supper is J. So John will not make supper is tilde J. And then we've got this word unless. Then he is very hungry. That is John, so that's H. Tilde J unless H. So what do we do with the unless? Does what comes immediately after it become the antecedent or the consequent? Well, let's try. Suppose we treat the word unless like the word if. So what comes immediately after unless becomes the antecedent, the other part becomes the consequent. If he's very hungry, then John won't make supper. Does that specify the same commitment about how the world is, as is indicated by the English sentence, John will not make supper unless he's very hungry? If he is very hungry, then he won't make supper. No. Well, maybe then we should treat it like an only if. So, what comes immediately after the unless will make the consequent of a conditional, and the other part becomes the antecedent. This gives us, if John isn't hungry, J stands for John will make supper. If John doesn't make supper, then he must be very hungry. That may be true again, but the question is, does that conditional specify the same commitment about the world as the English sentence, John will not make supper unless he is very hungry? Again, the answer is no. Here, we need to invoke what we can call the third principle, and this one, a little bit more complicated. It says, take the sentence immediately after an unless, and then there are two things that need to be done. Put a tilde in front of it, and make that the antecedent of a conditional. So let's see if that does it for us. So, John will not make supper unless he is very hungry will become, if it's not the case that John is very hungry, then John will not make supper. Does this indicate the same commitment about how the world is that's indicated by the English sentence? John will not make supper unless he is very hungry. If John isn't very hungry, then he won't make supper. Yes, this third one indicates the same commitment about how the world is as the English sentence. One last thing to notice about this particular sentence. We've got a conditional where both the antecedent and the consequent are negated. Where do those two negations come from? Well, the negation behind H is because H occurs immediately after the word unless. That's what puts a tilde in front of it and makes it the antecedent. There's a tilde in front of J because the English sentence contains the word not. It says John will not make supper unless he is very hungry. All right, so we move on now to question D. John works late if and only if Mary does not. Once again, we ask ourselves, does the sentence contain an if or an only if? This particular sentence seems to contain both. It says, John works late if and only if Mary does not. What we've got there is a conjunction of two different conditionals. So, the sentence, Mary does not what? Does not work late. So that's tilde W comes after the four-word phrase, if and only if. So, let's start off with the if. That means tilde W would be the antecedent of a conditional, and what's the other part of the sentence again? John works late, which is L, tilde W, horseshoe L, and then we've got Mary does not coming after an only if, which means it becomes the consequent of a conditional, and John works late becomes the antecedent. Now, this string obviously is not binary, so we put a pair of brackets around the two mirror image conditionals. So we've got a conjunction then of two mirror image conditionals. Now, if you return to page 2, some notes and exercise questions, and notice the fourth binary connective, this is the fifth connective we'll be considering. The connective symbol looks like three short lines. Notice what it's called, the triple bar, or you could have a bidirectional arrow. And the basic English equivalent for that, for the relation indicated by that symbol, is the English phrase if and only if, which does occur in the English sentence. So what this sentence is not a conditional, but a biconditional. And each of the two parts of the biconditional are just called bicons or equivalents. We don't really need the biconditional. All the biconditional is a way of compressing conjunctions of mirror image conditionals. So, a compressed version of the upper symbolization is tilde W triple bar L. Mary won't be working late if and only if John is working late. So you can imagine a situation, let's say they've got a kid, so they can't both be working late. They've got a kid with no one to take care of them, but they need money, so if Mary is not working late if and only if John is working late. In other words, if Mary isn't working late, then John is. And if John is working late, then Mary isn't. So that's the biconditional. It doesn't come up nearly as frequently. So the three most important binary connectives are the ampersand, which indicates a conjunction, the vel, which indicates a disjunction, and the horseshoe, which indicates a conditional. Before we move on to consider the second exercise on assignment 2, I just wanted to pause to emphasize the difference between conditionals and biconditionals. So consider the following three sentences. Capital S is going to stand for you are in Surrey. The Surrey, we know where Kwantlen is in the Lower Mainland. Capital B, you're in British Columbia. Capital P will stand for the sentence, you are in the city Priya was born in. One other fact about the world that's relevant here is that Priya was born in Surrey. So, the sentence, if you're in Surrey, then you're in British Columbia, is true as a matter of geographical fact. But the sentence, if you're in British Columbia, then you're in Surrey, is false as a matter of geographical fact, because there's lots of different places you could be in British Columbia where you're not in Surrey. So, since a conjunction of two conditionals can only be true when both of the conjuncts are true, this conjunction is false. Thus, you're in Surrey if and only if you're in British Columbia is also false because it's equivalent to this conjunction of mirror image conditionals. And generally, this is the situation. If one conditional is true, the mirror image of it is probably not. On the other hand, though, there are instances of this somewhat unusual situation. So, given that Priya was born in Surrey, it's true that if you're in Surrey, then you're in the city Priya was born in. It's also true, however, that if you're in the city Priya was born in, then you're in Surrey. So, unlike the top situation, this conjunction is true because both of the mirror image conditionals are true, and thus, you're in Surrey if and only if you're in the city Priya was born in is also true. This isn't generally the case. So, what we should take from that is the word if indicates a specific logical relation holding between two sentences. What comes immediately after the if is the antecedent of a conditional. Only if is another logical relation indicator. What occurs immediately after the only if is the consequent of a conditional. I should also note these quotations I'm putting on either side of the word, in this case the two-word phrase here, is to indicate that we're referring to the words themselves rather than the meaning of the words. So these are called scare quotes. Finally though, a third logical relation between two sentences is indicated by the four-word phrase, if and only if. What comes immediately after the only if, what comes immediately after the if and only if is going to be one of the bicons or equivalents in a biconditional. I'm emphasizing this because from past experience, I know that it's easy to confuse only if with if and only if. So it takes a little while to get used to this. Three different logical indicators here. If, only if, and only if. Very important to be clear on the difference between these three when we're symbolizing English sentences into the symbolic notation of the artificial language SL. Having familiarized ourselves with the 5 different logical connectives, there's just one more thing to consider from the table on the bottom part of page 2. And this is the rectangle in the bottom right-hand side of the table. There we see discussion of the main connective, which tells you the type of compound sentence the whole thing is. One of the key purposes of brackets, in fact, the primary purpose of brackets, is to use brackets in order to indicate what the main connective is in a longer symbolic string, as well as the way in which the various parts go together. Because if you don't, then the string of symbols, like these three, are open to different interpretations. So not only are these strings not binary, and we'll have to wait until after the first exam until we see why it's important for sentences to always be binary or two-part, but brackets, the most important use is to specify meaning or remove ambiguity. If a sentence is ambiguous, that just means it could mean one of several different things. And brackets can remove that ambiguity. Consider the following 3 simple sentences. Capital H stands for Hamilton wins tonight. Capital S stands for Surrey wins tonight. Capital W stands for Winnipeg is in first place. People might be discussing events having to do with a hockey league. What would be indicated by this symbolic string? Tilde, H, and S, horseshoe W. Depending on where the brackets go, we can have 3 quite different claims. I'm just taking this right off the table. If we put brackets around these 2 sentences, tilde H and S, then this would become a conditional. On the other hand, if we put brackets around those 2 sentences, this would become a conjunction of a negation and a conditional. A third way of ordering it, though, we could put one set of brackets around this conjunction to keep it together, and another set of brackets around the entire conditional. This bottom one is now a negation. So the main connective in the bottom sentence is the tilde. This is a denial of the conditional in the square brackets. The main connective in the middle one is the ampersand. This is a conjunction of a negated sentence and a conditional. The top one is a conditional. The main connective is the horseshoe. It's a conditional that has a negation, a conjunction of a negation in a simple sentence as the antecedent, and a simple sentence as the consequent. The importance of this, though, is that each of these three different bracket arrangements results in a different commitment about how the world is with respect to this hockey league. The top one says, if Hamilton doesn't win tonight and Surrey wins tonight, then Winnipeg is in first place. Might be a situation where Hamilton and Surrey are playing. Hamilton could possibly go ahead of Winnipeg and be in first place if they were to win, but if they don't win, then Winnipeg will remain in first place. So all that's being indicated about the world is there's this conditional relation between if these two things happen, or more pointedly, if this first thing, Hamilton winning, doesn't happen, and Surrey wins, then Winnipeg will be in first place. That's all that you're committing yourself to there. The conditional claim that if these two things are so, then this third thing is so. What about the middle one? Well, that's a conjunction. So what's being indicated there is, first of all, Hamilton isn't going to win, or didn't win tonight. No matter what else, Hamilton doesn't win tonight. That's one of the two conjuncts. The further commitment is, if Surrey wins, then Winnipeg is in first place. So there are two separate commitments there. There's a different commitment about how the world is. The third example would be a negation of a conditional relation. And here, it's not super important, but in order to have what I've got on the whiteboard here identical to what I've got on the paper, you'll notice I've got an additional bracket there. So if you feel like scratching out the bracket right next to the H on the bottom sentence on page 2, then you'll have it just like the whiteboard. So what would this symbolic string say? Well, it would say, it's not the case that if Hamilton wins and Surrey wins, then Winnipeg is in first place. Someone might make the claim, well look, if these two teams both win, because maybe they're both playing other teams that might be able to overtake Winnipeg, if these two teams both win, then Winnipeg's still in first place. Someone in response might say, no, that's wrong, your claim that if these two teams win, then Winnipeg's still in first place. So this is a denial of a conditional relation. And as such, the kind of sentence this is a negation. So brackets are also a very important part of the meaning of any symbolic sentence. So we've got the 5 connectives, we've got any number of capital letters, each of which has to stand for a distinct simple commitment about the world, and can never stand for more than one simple commitment about the world. And finally, we have different possible arrangements of bracketing. All three of those things work together to specify particular forms or underlying logical structures. And as always, the key thing for us is to make sure that the symbolization we construct exactly specifies the form or underlying logical structure indicated by the English sentence. Having reviewed the primary purpose for brackets in logic, namely to specify meaning or remove ambiguity, we can now consider some concrete examples of symbolization where brackets are used in this way. We'll start off with two sentences that are a little bit complex. These are sentences J and L in part 1 of assignment 2. Afterwards, we'll consider a couple of sentences from part 2 of assignment 2 that are even a little bit more complex. Before we begin the symbolization itself, here's the underlying idea. Whenever an English sentence is logically complex, to start the symbolization process, and here I've got two different ways of saying the same thing, find the main connective, that is to say, determine what kind of sentence the whole thing is. So anytime you have a long, complex sentence, there are 5 alternatives as far as answers to the question, what kind of sentence is this long string of words? It could be a negation, in which case the tilde would be the main connective. It could be a conjunction, in which case the ampersand would be the main connective, and so on. Another way of looking at this, though, that many people find helpful, when you're beginning the symbolization process, break the logically complex sentence in half. What you'll be doing here is connecting the two halves by the main connective. We won't see this with these first two sentences, but if you come up across a situation where once you've already broken the complex sentence in half, one or both of the halves is still pretty complex, all you have to do is repeat this process where you break that half in half. And you can continue to do that until you get to a sentence part that is just binary. When we are engaging in this process of correctly symbolizing complex sentences, there are 3 different ways to determine what the main connective in an English sentence is. The first one is punctuation. We don't see this in these 2 moderately complex examples. Another very important way is the wording. We're going to see a couple of examples of these. With the longer, more complex, we'll see the important role of punctuation. A third way of determining what the main connective is in terms of emphasis or intonation. That applies mainly to verbal instructions. Although with word processor technology, you can sometimes see emphasis or intonation being indicated in written sentences with bolding or italics. We begin then with sentence J, part 1, assignment 2. Only if John works late, and it is not a holiday, will Mary make supper. I've put square boxes around the three logical relation indicator. Two of them are single words, one of them is the two-word phrase, only if. Simple sentence indicators, we have John works late, that's L. It is a holiday, is O, and we'll be applying that not to it. Then we have the somewhat awkwardly worded in isolation sentence, will Mary make supper? That's going to be the sentence M. So the question is, which of these three logical relations is the main connective? It's not very often going to be the one place not. It can be where the entire sentence is the negation or denial of some logical relation that may be fairly complex. In this particular case, though, with the word not being embedded in a sentence, and it is not a holiday, the tilde pretty clearly applies to the simple sentence, oh, it is a holiday. So this leaves us with the two binary connective indicators, only if, which indicates a conditional, and the word and, which indicates a conjunction. Is the entire sentence a conjunction, perhaps? It could be. How can we tell? There is no punctuation. We can tell, though, by the wording. If this entire sentence were a big conjunction, what would the two conjuncts be? The string of words before the word and would be the left conjunct, and it says, only if John works late. That's an odd sort of sentence fragment. It's a half conditional. And the part after the word and, it is not a holiday, will Mary make supper. That's a string of words that doesn't really make sense. That's what tells us that this sentence isn't a conjunction. So it must then be a conditional. We've got an only if, which tells us that whatever comes immediately after the only if is the consequent of the conditional, and the other part is the antecedent. We've still got a question, though, as far as what are we going to count as the part that comes immediately after the only if. There are two possibilities. One is the simple sentence, John works late. The other one is the conjunction, John works late, and it is not a holiday. Suppose we tried the first one. Only if, so we've got John works late. So that's L. The antecedent of the conditional would then be the sentence indicated by the words, and it is not a holiday, will Mary make supper? Again, doesn't make sense. That's what tells us that the sentence immediately after the only if isn't just the simple sentence, John works late. What's the other possibility? The sentence immediately after the only if is the sentence, John works late and it is not a holiday. And the other part, the antecedent of the sentence, is indicated by the odd sounding in isolation string of words, will Mary work late? So that's indicated by the simple sentence, M. So this gives us the symbolization, if Mary's making supper, then John must be working late and it must not be a holiday. Let's consider whether or not this symbolization precisely specifies the form or underlying logical structure of the English sentence. Only if John works late and it is not a holiday will Mary make supper. In other words, only under certain fairly specific conditions will Mary be making supper. That's what's indicated by this symbolization. If Mary is making supper, then these two things must be. First of all, John must be working late, and second of all, it must be a holiday. At this point, there's one more thing I'd like to emphasize here, and this is that if this is the first time you've done a symbolization like this, it might seem to you harder than it really is. This is the reason I've given you a fair number of assignment questions. Just about everything in this course is going to seem more difficult than it really is to you because it's a kind of computational activity that you've never really done before. But the more symbolization questions you do, you'll begin to internally master the symbolization process, and symbolizing a sentence like this will fairly quickly strike you as a fairly easy task. So don't be thrown off if what we're considering seems kind of hard at the beginning. This is the point of doing the exercise questions. What seems hard initially will become easier and easier. So there's question J. Question L. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he is working late. We've got an and conjunctive indicator. We've got the word unless. That's a conditional indicator, remember. And we've got the word or, a disjunctive indicator. So this entire sentence could be a conjunction, could be a conditional, could be a disjunction. Once again, no punctuation that will give us any clue. There's only the period at the end. So we're going to have to focus on the wording. We've got 4 simple sentences here. John makes supper. John washes the dishes. It is a holiday, not negated this time. He is working late, being John, so that's L. Let's consider the first hypothesis. The whole thing is a big conjunction. In that case, the first or left conjunct would be John will make supper. The right conjunct will be wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he is working late. Doesn't make sense. So it's not a conjunction. Let's skip over the unless and consider maybe it's a big disjunction where the left disjunct is kind of a long one. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless it is a holiday. The other disjunct, he is working late. This one, it seems a lot more to make sense, but it's not a disjunction. If it were a disjunction, instead of saying he is working late, it would say John is working late. So consider the sentence slightly changed. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless it is a holiday, or John is working late. One other thing, notice how since I'm treating the sentence verbally, by intonation, I could emphasize the word or and make that into a disjunction. The suggested meaning, or the clear meaning I would say here, is that it's a conditional. So the sentence or the main connective of the sentence is indicated by the word unless. John will make supper and wash the dishes, unless it is a holiday or he is working late. So the part that comes immediately after the unless is the remainder of the sentence. It is a holiday or he is working late. What's the rule for the unless again? You take the sentence immediately after the word unless, and the sentence immediately after the word unless, in this case, isn't just the simple sentence, it's a holiday, but it's the disjunction, it's a holiday or he is working late. So we make that the antecedent of the conditional, but before doing so, we put a tilde in front of the disjunction, in order to indicate that the tilde isn't just applying to the part it's a holiday, but to the disjunction, we put the brackets around the tilde. Notice we don't need any additional brackets to indicate that the tilde stays with this disjunction. That's indicated already by the rules for applying the disjunction. Then the other part of the conditional, which is going to be the consequent, is everything before the unless, which is John will make supper and wash the dishes. John will make supper and John will wash the dishes. Once again, we want to keep this conjunction together as the consequent of the conditional, so we'll put brackets like that. So the underlying logical structure, or the form of the English sentence, John will make supper and wash the dishes, unless it is a holiday or he is working late, is indicated by this symbolic sentence in the artificial language, SL. If it's not the case that it's a holiday or he's working late, then John will make supper and wash the dishes. One last thing to note before we leave off from this sentence: this does happen in English. People not really carefully considering the logical implications of what they're saying or writing might leave a sentence somewhat ambiguous. That is to say, you can come across sentences where arguably either of two different symbolizations are plausible. In this case, I maintain that this is the only one that's plausible, but in order to make things extra clear, I would have put a comma after the word dishes, so that we would have John will make supper and wash the dishes, comma. So that identifies a clear break in the subject matter. Then we have unless it is a holiday or he is working late. And certainly for the exam, I'm going to, in a case like, if this would have been a question on the exam, I certainly would have put a comma there to make it crystal clear. So in L, the main connective is the horseshoe. The stuff after the unless gets negated and put in brackets. The rest of it, in this case the stuff before the unless, is a conjunction, and it also gets put in brackets. I believe I had said earlier that after considering the first part of assignment 2, we would move on to the second, more challenging part. I looked over the exercises and it struck me that this is the best order in which to do all of these exercise questions. So we've got assignment 1, which says exercise 2.4 at the top. That's on page 5 in the file, some notes and exercise questions. After that, assignment 2, part 1. But instead of proceeding to assignment 2, part 2, let's move straight to assignment 3, parts C and D, which is on page 7 of the Some Notes and Exercises file. After that, we'll return to assignment 2, part 2, and finally to assignment 4. What I wanted to set up for you was a set of symbolization questions that starts off somewhat straightforward, not super easy, but doable, and then very gradually proceeds to more and more complicated questions. At this point, maybe I'll pull out the class syllabus again to remind you of some ideas that I read to you in the very first lecture. So I'm just reading off the syllabus here. To succeed in this class, you are going to have to, 1, be familiar with the range of theoretical material and key logical concepts that sets out the underlying rationale for the various exercise questions you will be working on throughout the semester. So up until now, what we've been doing is laying the theoretical groundwork that gives symbolizing English sentences into this symbolic language a point. What we want to do is zero in on the form or underlying logical structure of those English sentences. In assignment 4, which we'll be getting to, we finally got not individual sentences, but arguments to symbolize. The second thing you need to be familiar with to succeed in this class is, reading from the syllabus again, instill a deeper practical awareness of how to carry out various logical computations successfully by actually completing those exercise questions. I'll skip the next paragraph. Regarding 2, that is instilling this deeper practical awareness. The deeper practical learning, you're going to have to spend at least 2 hours per week doing questions from the exercises. So here's the situation. Hopefully, after watching the videos, from a theoretical standpoint, you understand everything, and you may think you understand the material and you're ready for the exam. Hear me now, believe me later. You need to do a fair number of assignment questions in order to internalize the practical ability to correctly and reliably symbolize English sentences. And there's no other way to do that except by doing exercise questions yourself. So this is part of the learning process that I can't teach you. I've taught you the part that will set you up, but now you've got to do the actual work in order to master the deeper learning that's necessary to succeed in this course. That being said, we can now proceed to assignment 3. The sentences themselves in assignment 3 aren't super complex, most of them. What's new about assignment 3, though, is that we see a number of logical words and indicator phrases that we haven't seen earlier. Before we proceed to assignment 3, I'll just draw your attention to pages 2 and 3 in the Some Notes and Exercise questions. Page 3 gives a whole bunch of examples of English words or phrases that might be used to indicate the conjunction, the disjunction, the conditional, and the biconditional. Page 4 of the Some Notes and Exercise Questions gives a range of concrete examples of negations, conjunctions, disjunctions, conditionals, biconditionals. Gives some examples of not both sentences, neither nor, only if, unless sentences. And finally, gives us a number of examples of somewhat more complex logical constructions. So both pages 3 and 4 in the Some Notes and Exercise Questions will be useful to review in the process of symbolizing questions in Assignment 3. We'll start Assignment 3. I'm just going to do a few questions here. On the left-hand side, we have Part C. We'll go down to question 14, which says, assuming that Julio is a bachelor, he is a man who is unmarried. Julio is a bachelor is B. Julio is a man is M. Julio is married can't be M again, so it's symbolized by J. The phrase I want to focus on here is assuming that. That's a logical indicator phrase. What logical relation does it indicate? If you go to the conditional examples on page 3 of the Some Notes and Exercise Questions, they give some examples. P whenever Q is symbolized as P horseshoe Q. P to the extent that, P provided that, are also symbolized Q horseshoe P. So notice then that the sentence before which the phrase when, whenever, to the extent that, or provided that, and notice in all 4 of those instances, here's the important thing to look for. Q is the sentence that comes immediately after those phrases. Whenever Q, when Q, or where Q, provided that Q, to the extent that Q, in all 4 of those situations, Q is the antecedent of a conditional. They didn't mention this particular one in that sheet, but notice question 14. Assuming that Julio is a bachelor, he is a man who is unmarried. Again, whatever comes after the phrase assuming that is the antecedent of a conditional. What comes after the phrase assuming that is Julio is a bachelor. Notice they have a comma there. That makes it easy for us as far as deciding what sentence comes immediately after assuming that. It's just the simple sentence, Julio is a bachelor, which is symbolized with B. That's the antecedent of a conditional. And the other part is the consequent, which is he is a man, Julio namely, who is unmarried. In other words, Julio is a man, and notice Julio is married is J, so Julio is unmarried would be tilde J. So in that case, the prefix un functions as a negation indicator. Again, can't emphasize this enough, the more assignment questions you do, the more familiar you become with the process of symbolization, the easier this kind of stuff is going to become. For many people, this stuff seems harder than it really is at the beginning. So if it seems a little bit challenging to you, it seems like there's a lot of things you have to keep track of. The more you do it, the more exercise questions you do, the more familiar and the easier it will become. Next, we turn to the two phrases, X is a necessary condition for Y, and X is a sufficient condition for Y. These two logical indicators occur fairly commonly in scientific literature, and they also occur fairly commonly in arguments that make use of scientific findings. Very useful then to be aware of the logical relations indicated by these two phrases. Here's a couple of simple examples to illustrate what's meant. Suppose that capital L here stands for the simple sentence, you have a lottery ticket. Capital W stands for the simple sentence, you win or you won the lottery. Then the following is a sentence in English, somewhat abbreviated. Your possessing or having a lottery ticket is a necessary condition for your winning the lottery. And that's true. In order to win the lottery, it's necessary that you possess a lottery ticket. The winning lottery ticket, namely. Does that mean then that if you possess a lottery ticket, then you win the lottery? If only that were so. Merely possessing a lottery ticket is hardly a guarantee that you'll win the lottery. On the other hand, does this English sentence entail, if you win the lottery, then you must have a lottery ticket? Can't win the lottery without having a lottery ticket. It's this one. So the underlying logical implication of this English sentence, possessing a lottery ticket is a necessary condition for winning the lottery, is if you win the lottery, then you must have a lottery ticket. W horseshoe L. So what that tells us as far as symbolizing goes is that necessary conditions, that is to say, whatever simple sentence is identified as being a necessary condition, or it may be a more complex sentence, but in this case it's just a simple sentence, whatever is identified as a necessary condition is the consequent of a conditional, not the antecedent. Now we can turn to sufficient conditions. Geographical examples are good for illustrating sufficient conditions. Capital P stands for the simple sentence, you are in Paris, the Paris where the Eiffel Tower is. Capital F stands for the simple sentence, you are in France. It's true that being in Paris is a sufficient condition for being in France. Once again, we can ask ourselves, is the underlying logical implication of this English sentence, your being in Paris is a sufficient condition for your being in France? If you're in Paris, then you're in France. Or if you're in France, then you're in Paris. Answer, this time, it's the top one. What that tells us is that sufficient conditions, unlike necessary conditions, are antecedents of conditionals. So that's all you really need to be aware of. Necessary conditions, consequence of conditionals. So it's not whatever simple sentence or whatever sentence comes immediately after the phrase necessary conditions. It's whatever is described as being the necessary condition or the sufficient condition. In the case of the necessary condition, it's the consequent of a conditional. In the case of a sufficient condition, it's the antecedent of a conditional. With that in mind, we turn to assignment 3, question 15. Erin's being penniless is a sufficient condition for her being miserable. So we've got two simple sentences. Capital P, Erin is penniless. Capital M, Erin is miserable. So we've got the phrase, a sufficient condition. What's described as the sufficient condition here? Answer, Erin's being penniless, or the truth of the simple sentence, Erin is penniless. So since that's a simple condition, it's the antecedent of a conditional. So the underlying logical implications of the English sentence, Erin's being penniless is a sufficient condition for her being miserable, is the following. If she's penniless, then she's miserable. You can know that right away. Even if she's wealthy, she might still be miserable. Erin might be miserable all the time. But that English sentence commits us to the following. If she is penniless, then you know she's miserable. Not that if she's miserable, then she must be penniless. For all sentence 15 says, she might be very wealthy and still miserable. What about question 16? Kareem's being tall is a necessary condition for his being on the team. Capital K stands for the sentence, Kareem is tall. Capital T stands for the sentence, Kareem is on the team. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Kareem refers to an NBA player way back in the 70s. I believe Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the first player in the NBA that was 7 feet tall or higher. There had been a couple that were pretty close, 6'11", but Kareem was the first player in the NBA that was 7 feet tall. So Kareem is definitely tall. What does the English sentence commit us to, though, here? Kareem's being tall is a necessary condition for his being on the team. Does that tell us, okay, well, Kareem is definitely tall, so he must be on the team. His being tall is described as a necessary condition, which means it's not the antecedent, but the consequent of a conditional, and the other part is the antecedent. So the English sentence, Kareem's being tall is a necessary condition for his being on the team, just tells us if he is on the team, then Kareem must be tall. It doesn't say if he is tall, then he must be on the team. Now we can turn to question 17. Here we've got an example of what's called a double negation. The statement, and then in scare quotes to indicate the string of words itself, Santa does not exist, is false. Let's suppose that Santa exists, as they have in brackets, is symbolized by the capital S. So Santa exists is S. What would Santa does not exist be then? It would be tilde S. Notice that's a compound statement. It's got a logical connective, namely a tilde connected to it. And capital letters can only be used to symbolize simple sentences. So S can't stand for a sentence like Santa does not exist, or it's false that Santa exists. Given that we've got tilde S symbolizing the statement in the quotation marks there, Santa does not exist, how do we symbolize 17, the statement tilde S is false? Answer, we just put another tilde in front of it. Tilde, tilde S. No additional brackets are necessary. Just to repeat, the way the tilde works, it always applies to the first full sentence immediately after it or to the right of it. So this tilde applies to the simple sentence S. This tilde applies to the sentence tilde S. In theory, we're not going to have something like this, but you could have any number of tildes in front of a sentence. No additional brackets are necessary. The way the tildes work, this innermost one refers to the simple sentence S. This middle one refers to the sentence tilde S. And the outermost one refers to the sentence tilde tilde S. So the correct symbolization of 17 would be tilde tilde S. One last thing to point out, shouldn't be a surprise. If you recall me saying earlier, what you need to do for symbolization is write out a correct symbolization of the sentence in English. And a correct symbolization is a symbolization that exactly specifies the underlying logical implications of the English sentence. So, tilde tilde S would do it, but so, of course, would S. Because to say it's false that Santa doesn't exist is the same thing as saying Santa does exist. Okay. We'll end our consideration of symbolization by just considering a couple of questions from assignment 2, part 2. After that, I'm going to move on to the final topic area for the first exam, and at the end of that, we will reconsider symbolization in assignment 4, where we are considering the assignments of the forms not just of individual sentences, but of entire arguments. That being said, here's question J in part 2 of assignment 2. Neither stock prices nor consumer spending will fall, provided unemployment does not rise and there is a boom in either housing or the automobile industry. We've got a number of simple sentences, 5 of them. We've also got a number of logical indicators. We've got the pair of words neither nor. Then we've got the word provided, the word not, the word and, the pair of words either or. In this example, we've got a comma, which is an important indicator So all the stuff before the comma stays together. All of the stuff after the comma also stays together. In order to realize that, though, we need to note that the sentence after the word "and" would be a little bit awkward sounding if it was on its own. In other words, consider how this would sound if we treated J as a conjunction, where this "and" is indicating the main connective. Neither stock prices nor consumer spending will fall, provided unemployment does not rise. All of that would be one conjunct. The other conjunct: there is a boom in either housing or the automobile industry. On its own, that clause doesn't make sense because we've got a prediction here. If, on the other hand, it had said there will be a boom in either housing or the automobile industry, that would make the sentence ambiguous, which is to say it could possibly have two different plausible interpretations. But since it doesn't, what the sentence requires is straightforward. The one area that some of you might find a little bit tricky, the word "provided." Here, it might be helpful to refer back to the table on page 3. Provided, or provided that, is a conditional indicator, and whatever sentence comes immediately after the provided that is going to be the antecedent of a conditional. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, the sentence that comes immediately after provided that is not just up to the word "and", but it's the entire string of words. So, provided unemployment does not rise, unemployment does rise as U, tilde U, unemployment does not rise, and there is a boom in either housing or the automobile industry, or in the best case scenario, I suppose, both of them. So H stands for there's a boom in the housing industry, A stands for there's a boom in the automobile industry. If it's not the case that unemployment rises and there's a boom in at least one of the housing industry or the automobile industry, all of that is the antecedent of a conditional. So we put a second set of brackets around that. There's no special meaning in them being squared. You could put them rounded like the first ones, that's not wrong. I just have a habit of doing it that way because I find it makes it easier just by looking at the sentence to understand where the brackets go. All of that then is the antecedent of the conditional, and the consequent of the conditional is the stuff before the word provided. Neither stock prices nor consumer spending will fall. F stands for stock prices will fall. S stands for consumer spending will fall. Neither of those things are going to happen. So we're starting to get a little bit complicated. If U doesn't happen, and at least one of these two does happen, then it's not the case that either of these things are going to happen. This is the symbolization that isolates the form or the underlying logical structure indicated by this English sentence. Finally, we will end off our consideration of symbolization in sentential logic, symbolization for individual sentences, considering question N, the last question in part 2 of assignment 2. If you look at this, quite a complicated foreboding sentence. More jobs will be created and the economy will improve only if government spending is increased and taxes are not raised. However, the deficit will be reduced only if taxes are raised and government spending is not increased. And the economy will improve if and only if the deficit is reduced. What in the world are we going to do with that? Again, though, keep in mind, this is a perfect example where the strategy, just break it in half, and in doing so determine the main connective for the entire sentence, will do us well here. Then, here's an example where each of the individual halves, we may have to strategically break them in half, and so on. In this particular case, we have a semicolon. That's the key to determining the main connective for the entire sentence. So, as far as determining the main connective, we could just look at that first sentence as telling us blah, 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 semicolon. Then we see the word however, and then blah, 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 blah. The word however is both a conjunction indicator and a contrast indicator. The word however then is like the word but it's got an even somewhat stronger element of contrast. So the entire sentence then is a big conjunction. So I'll put an ampersand in the middle, and each of the two halves, which are likely to be pretty complex, are going to go inside those square brackets. At this point then, let's consider all of the stuff before the word however. More jobs will be created and the economy will improve only if government spending is increased and taxes are not raised. What we have there is a conditional. I won't bother to write this sentence out, but by the wording we can tell that everything before the word only if is the antecedent of a conditional, everything after is the consequent. So I can put a conditional there. What we're doing is breaking that half in half. Now when we come to breaking in half the halves of that, things are quite manageable. More jobs will be created and the economy will improve, which is just going to be J, more jobs will be created or are created. Temporal indicators aren't logically significant, and the economy improves. That's going to happen only if government spending is increased and taxes are not raised. So G and tilde T. Are we done yet? Well, we're done the first half. Now we can move to consider the other conjunct, which is after the word however. The deficit will be reduced only if taxes are raised and government spending is not increased, comma, there's an important indicator, and the economy will improve if and only if the deficit is reduced. So in the second half, the comma and tells us that we've got a conjunction in that second half. Now we just go to break each of those halves in half. let's start with the stuff after the comma and. The economy will improve if and only if the deficit is reduced. So that's just E, if and only if, D. So now all we have to do is finish the part after the word however and up to the comma and. The deficit will be reduced only if taxes are raised and government spending is not increased. Again, the wording tells us that we've got a conditional here. We've got an only if. So what comes after the only if? Taxes are raised and government spending is not increased. So that's T and tilde G. Oops. I hope I've got enough room here. I think we can make it. So the ampersand goes here. T and tilde G. Now all we've got to do is get the part after the however and up to the only if. The deficit will be reduced, which is D. So D, and here maybe I'll redo this since I've got a little more room. D, horseshoe, and then in brackets, T and tilde G. Ooh. Put our ampersand again. Now there's one more thing we need to do. Put another set of square brackets there to indicate that that conditional goes together. And there we have it. A fairly complex sentence, I'll admit, which requires a fairly complex symbolization. If you do it all systematically though, you can make a long, complicated project. You can break it down into smaller and increasingly manageable pieces. So, over the next several days, you should be spending all of your time in this course doing symbolization questions, internalizing the ability to convert English sentences into symbolizations that reveal very straightforwardly their form or underlying logical structure. So I'll be putting the solutions up shortly for assignment 1, assignment 2, and assignment 3. As I had said earlier, after we consider the last part of this first unit before the first exam, we will return to assignment 4.